It's midwinter, 1657. John Washington looks over his ship, which has just run aground off the coast of Virginia. His cargo of tobacco was ruined. John had put his life savings into the voyage, and now it was all lost. The ship could be saved, but the tobacco he planned to sell in England was worthless. John was 24, born in England. His father, a clergyman, had died penniless 5 years earlier. So John faced an agonizing decision. Was he going to go back to England empty-handed? Or would he take his chances in the new colony of Virginia? 120 years later, John's great-grandson, George Washington, would become the first president of the United States.
Most people, when they study the origins of the United States and colonial period, think about New England, think about the Pilgrims, think about the Puritans. Most are not familiar with the name of John Washington. He was an immigrant to Virginia. This guy comes over here, founds a family that 3 generations later produces this iconic figure, George Washington, whose story will be told in future centuries.
The Washington family does reflect remarkably accurately a considerable number of the social, economic, and religious changes of the 16th and 17th centuries. Increasing social mobility, religious and political tensions, immigration. Those are big themes in any English history textbook, and the Washingtons have got them all in their family.
For the Washingtons, the story centers around their ancestral home, Sulgrave Manor. The story of the Washingtons at Sulgrave begins with John's great-great-grandfather, Lawrence, the builder of Sulgrave Manor, 150 years earlier. It was the time of Henry VIII, and England was at peace for the first time in 400 years. Lawrence had been offered an excellent job and had moved south from his home in the north of England. He didn't know it then, but this was an opportunity that was going to change his life and his family's fortunes forever.
And really, for 400 years, young men like Lawrence Washington, they're able to make their way in the world other than by the force of arms. They can make it through peaceful means, trade, expanding rapidly, industry, and of course, through farming and various other peaceful means.
The first known reference to the Washington family is actually in the 12th century, based around the village of Wessington in northern England. At that time, the English language wasn't standardized and was full of different pronunciations and spellings. But by the time of Henry VIII, it had become more standard, and the Wessingtons were known as the Washingtons.
In the 13th and 14th century, people of this class made their livings by fighting. They were knights. And this is why the Washingtons have a coat of arms.
The Washington coat of arms, with its stars and its stripes, is something that has very obviously had a big influence on the American flag. The Washingtons gained their coat of arms right back in the first place by valor in battle. And the stars that you see on the shield, of course, are not really stars. It's a reference to the spurs on the boots that were worn by people on top of their horses riding into battle.
Now, in the early 16th century, during the peaceful reign of Henry VIII, the Washingtons made their living as caretakers for the estates of rich noblemen. Lawrence was an educated young man, and in his mid-20s had been given the job of looking after the properties of Lord William Parr, who was one of the richest noblemen in England. In 1529, Lord Parr sent young Lawrence 150 miles south to manage his properties near Northampton. Northampton was a busy market town in the centre of the burgeoning wool trade.
So Lawrence is well placed at 29 with good contacts, but also extraordinarily well placed because a whole new era in English history was about to open up.
Prosperity brought tremendous business opportunities for ambitious young men, and thus prospects for social advancement.
But within 6 months of coming down, Lawrence decides to leave the employ of Sir William Parr, because when he gets down to Northampton, he discovers that his cousin is actually making a fortune out of the wool trade. So he decides that here's an opportunity to make some real money. Here's an opportunity, perhaps, to drag himself out of the more subservient class to that of the landowning gentry.
While he was in Northampton, he seems to have come to a life-changing decision. He left the very safe position he held with Lord Parr.
And then he sets himself up as a wool merchant in Northampton itself.
At the same time, he married a rich widow of a wool merchant. He took over her husband's business and became evidently very successful very fast.
If there isn't a man who isn't an opportunist as Lawrence Washington, there never will be. I mean, there he is, he's already got a terrific post in one of the richest families of England, and yet he sees an opportunity to make even more money, and he grabs it. And in 3 years, he's wheedled his way into a society that he's never been involved in. He obviously had charm, he obviously had a personality. I think you've got to see him as somebody who always had the eye for the main chance. That's why he succeeds. So Lawrence Washington, typical nouveau rich, having made money through a peaceful England, is now able to buy his own estate and to set himself up. Now he is part of the landowning gentry. It's now that he builds Sulgrave Manor House to be a home for his second wife, Amy, and eventually their 11 children.
The building of Sulgrave House is in itself very, very typical of houses of this date and type. It's very much what you would expect of the house built by somebody who was wealthy, but not super rich. Somebody doing okay.
When Lawrence came here, he probably built a relatively small house. And as the family grew, and more importantly, as his wealth grew, he was able to add more and more rooms.
The decoration on the south porch at Sulgrave tells the world that Lawrence makes his money from sheep. The triangle is a symbol of the Wool Merchants Guild, and it's supported by 2 sheep's heads.
Below that, you have the ultimate mark of success in late Tudor England, and that is a coat of arms of Queen Elizabeth I.
It's got a great big great hall, which is the sort of business room of the house. That's where everything happens. It's where it's sort of like part office, part living room, part dining room.
This is where the servants were coming in and out, the shepherds were coming in and out, the steward and the lord were doing their business. So it's a very public area where also the family would have eaten. This table would accommodate not only Lawrence, Amy and their 11 children, but 3 or 4 of the most important servants as well. Though other servants, of course, would be required to wait on the servants.
The table is called the board. The top has 2 sides, a rough side for daily work and a shiny side for special occasions. The board has given us a number of expressions we still use today. For instance, if your host didn't think well of you, your meal would be served on the rough side of the board, and you'd have the tables turned on you. And sitting around the board, everyone would be on benches and stools, except the most important person, who would be given a proper chair. Chairs were valuable items, and this is where we get the term chairman of the board.
Mr. Washington during this period was away on business an awful lot. He had business interests in Northampton and also visits down to London. A lot of travelling, a lot of living away from home. So when he's away, Mrs. Washington is the head of the household, in charge of the whole estate.
Year-round, there would be crops to plant and harvest, land and livestock to maintain, but the real business of Sulgrave was wool. The men would herd and care for the sheep, and in the spring, the hard work of shearing would begin. Most of the wool would then be collected and sold to brokers and weavers in town. The wool that was kept for use at the manor would be carded and spun by the women in the household. A place of Sulgrave's size would need a staff of 20 to 30 people, depending on the season. Shearing and harvest times would be the busiest, and those workers would need to be housed and fed on the property. Between the Washingtons, with their 11 children and all the servants and workers, there were many mouths to feed, so work went on in the kitchen all day long. The women at Sulgrave Manor would cook and clean. They'd make butter and cheese, brew beer, and make medicines from the kitchen herb garden.
During the day, the main bedroom in Sulgrave is a private space away from the hustle and bustle of the hall downstairs. And it's also a place where particularly the women of the household would be doing a lot of their tasks. So spinning and sewing, all those sorts of small-scale indoor domestic stuff. At night, quite a different thing. At night, the main bed is occupied by Mr. and Mrs. And then around the bed are many other people sleeping. Younger children and junior servants sleep on the floor in the same room on pull-out beds. The curtains on this bed, the hangings on the bed, would be of the most gorgeous stuff that you could afford to have. It's a status thing, it's a showing off thing, as well as being warm and comfy. And in the depths of winter in Britain, when it's flipping freezing and you've got almost no central heating and maybe not even particularly good glass in the windows, you want to be away from the drafts. It's a real luxury to be able to pull the curtains and be warm inside. It also gives a degree of privacy. And in rooms which are shared between many, many people, privacy is a luxury. So using textiles, embroideries, is part of the sort of armoury of getting on in the world, putting on a good show so that everything's, I see the Washington family are doing all right.
Entertaining at Sulgrave is an important part of life. In Tudor England, you're always making connections, both for business and to find good matches for your sons and daughters. And those connections may bring you closer to nobility or even royalty. And entertaining on a lavish scale shows others you're financially stable.
They're aiming at making people think that they're credit-worthy. That's particularly important. This is a world before proper banking. So if you want to have a loan, people have to believe that you're going to be able to pay it back. So if you put on a really good display of being, we're doing all right, thank you very much, people think, oh, it's safe to loan them money. They'll be all right to do business with, because I'll get my money back. So actually, from a business point of view, keeping up appearances had a lot of usefulness to it.
The children at Sulgrave were taught to read and write, usually by tutors who travelled from house to house.
R first, so down at the bottom here.
So there were a lot of people who had a bit of education, who nonetheless couldn't write, but could just about read. Enough to read the Bible. And that, of course, was the main point.
Start from there.
So in Sulgrave, the chances are that probably about half the people in the house could read and write, to some degree, to some level.
Very well done.
When Lawrence and Amy moved to Sulgrave, the property included the church of St. James the Less, which was built in the 1300s and still stands today. It was at this church that the Washington family worshipped. Many of them were married and buried there as well. As Lord of the Manor, Lawrence had the Washington family pew in the front of the church, closest to the altar. Lawrence, Amy, and their eldest son, Robert, are buried in a tomb at the foot of the pew. And attached to the tombstone are brass plates representing Lawrence, Amy, and their 11 children.
It's worth remembering that the English parish church in the 16th century serves as parish hall, meeting place, centre for family occasions like baptisms, marriages, funerals. The church is very much the centre of community life and not just a place of religious worship.
Lawrence Washington's family and fortunes grew, and surprisingly, all of his 11 children survived into maturity. In Tudor times, between 1/3 and 1/2 of children died before they were 5, so the Washingtons were of hardy stock. And Lawrence himself died when he was 84, which was unusually long-lived.
In his efforts to settle his family, Lawrence was relatively successful. All of his daughters were well married off to people of wealth and standing commensurate to Lawrence's at the time, and his sons were, as was normal, put into different trades.
Lawrence the Builder has a son named Lawrence, who also has a son named Lawrence. And Lawrence's son, Robert, also has a son named Lawrence. The Lawrence name gets complicated in telling the Washington story. With so many children having large families, the name Lawrence appears in each generation, always once and sometimes more.
Life would be so much easier if, in 16th century England, they'd been a bit more inventive in their choice of names, particularly the Washington family, where every second person is called Lawrence or Robert.
Robert's grandson, also named Lawrence, would be the father of John Washington, the emigrant to the New World. This Lawrence was the 5th son of 17 children born at Sulgrave.
By the time you get to the 5th son, you've basically run out of land to be able to set them up in their own manners. So you've got to find them a career. And after trade and land, the only other source of a career was the church in those days. And the church, like the court, was a way of making sure that you had a job for life.
Lawrence was sent to Oxford University, which was the main training ground for the Church of England. It was the place to be for a young man wanting to rise through the church hierarchy. When he graduated, he was immediately elected a fellow, which was the first step toward higher office in the church establishment.
Lawrence's career became, from this point, totally caught up in the developments which were to lead a few years later to the English Civil War.
In the Civil War, the Washingtons were very involved physically in providing soldiers and being on the battlefields themselves. They were involved in the very first battle of the Civil War, which took place just 15 miles from Sulgrave at Edge Hill. They were involved at another battle that took place just 5 miles from Sulgrave at Cromarty Bridge.
These great battles, skirmishes, vital control points are very close to Sulgrave. So anyone living at Sulgrave in the outbreak of war would have been more conscious than most English people of what was happening.
Sulgrave Manor itself was laid to siege during the Civil War in 1644.
4 Royalist soldiers were given refuge at Sulgrave Manor until they were captured after a siege by parliamentarians. And just 30 miles away, 2 members of the Washington family died in the siege of Oxford. The Church of England, the Anglican Church, came under attack early in the war. In 1643, shortly after fighting broke out, Parliament began to investigate the allegiance of English priests.
The Reverend Lawrence Washington, as a well-known supporter of the Royalist cause, becomes one of their first targets. And he is literally dragged before the courts. The Puritan courts find him guilty of all sorts of misdemeanors against the Puritan ethic.
Reverend Lawrence is branded as a scandalous, malicious priest, accused of being a drunk, and I think of swearing. And I don't think those charges are credible. I think he's removed mainly because he's part of the established church that the reformers want to get at.
The Rev Lawrence was thrown out of his comfortable position at Purley. He became so impoverished that his wife and their 5 children had to move back to her parents' home near London. Devoted to the church, he was able to secure a part-time position as a preacher in the nearby village of Little Braxted. Little Braxted was a poor community with a tiny, roughly built church. It would have been a humiliating come-down for Reverend Lawrence. The Reverend Lawrence died just as the war ended, having spent the rest of his career at Little Braxted.
And when he dies in 1653, all the circumstances suggest that he's a broken man in material resources and in terms of his own place in that society. And it's into that situation that his son has to figure out where he's going to go.
Reverend Lawrence's eldest son, John, was 19 at the end of the Civil War. In the wake of his father's disgrace, there was no family property for John to inherit, so he had to forge a new path for himself. His decision would change the Washington family's fortunes and eventually transform the New World. We know that John had become a skilled sailor because in 1656, when he was 24, he received an offer from a shipowner named Edward Prescott to be the second master of the Seahorse of London, a ship that traded tobacco with the colony at Virginia.
Traveling across the Atlantic Ocean in the 17th century was dangerous. An awful lot of people died on the crossing or died within a year or so of disease. Virginia in particular was a very unhealthy place through most of the 17th century. So Virginia was, in some ways, the Wild West of the 17th century for Englishmen who were ambitious enough and daring enough. I can't emphasize that enough. These are people who are open to the main chance and who are willing to take a risk. And the people who don't do that stay back in England and try to find a place for themselves in that traditional society.
But John and Prescott's ship arrived safely in Virginia in the late fall of 1656 and began making its way along the coast.
They would be sailing up and down that very fragmented coast because on most of the bays and most of the rivers, on most of the creeks, there would be a plantation, and each plantation would deal directly with the ships.
John and Prescott successfully traded their European goods in Virginia for a full load of tobacco. They were anxious to sail back to England as soon as possible to avoid the winter storms in the North Atlantic. But the ship was overloaded. In their haste, moving through the shallows of the Potomac River, the ship ran aground at Pope's Creek. The hull flooded, and all the tobacco was ruined.
John has run aground in Virginia, and his whole tobacco cargo is destroyed. A huge investment. His life, his career, his merchants.
John had put all his money and all his hopes into the partnership with Prescott. But now he was left penniless. The ship could be repaired, so John could go back to England, but he would have to start all over again with nothing.
This must have been a pivotal moment. We now know how many families, individuals, found it too hard in the New World and went home. But England is not attractive to a royalist family, so despite the loss of his burgeoning merchant career, John stays in Virginia, and American history is transformed.
John's younger brother Lawrence moved to Virginia from England in 1659 to join him in his business. Their sister arrived in 1679. John became a judge and was later elected to the House of Burgesses, which was the council that represented Virginia to the King in England. John's son and grandsons followed in his footsteps, accumulating land and becoming leaders in the colony.
And within 3 generations, the wealth, power, and the Washingtons grows and grows and grows until in 1732, at that self-same spot, Pope's Creek in Virginia, is born George Washington, who becomes obviously the first president of the United States. And it seems that the Washingtons' establishment there and their expansion there replicates almost directly the establishment of the wealth of the Washingtons in Tudor England by his 5 times great-grandfather, Lawrence Washington.
From the first Lawrence coming down from Lancashire to John Washington going to Virginia, there seems to be a willingness to take a hard-headed decision of improvement. It shows perhaps the same practicality, the same emotional toughness, the same resilience in the face of whatever fortune throws at you. With George Washington, I think one can see some element of that family pragmatism and ambition.
Sulgrave Manor House represents the culmination of the career of Lawrence Washington, an individualist. And of course, surely that is what the American nation was founded on, giving each individual the opportunity of making their life something more than it had been in the past. A new world, the new world.
What we are trying to do here at Sulgrave Manor is to point out the degree of shared history, the relationship between the peoples. We are where we are as a house because the Washingtons moved. We are where we are as 2 nations because not only did John Washington move physically, George Washington moved philosophically.
Of course, Sulgrave Manor is very much more than a lovely old Tudor house. It's the one place in the whole world which is the embodiment of the closeness between America and Britain. There's nowhere else, anywhere, that's the same in that way as Sulgrave.